At NeoTeas, we're always on the lookout for the best Japanese green tea, and part of that is taste testing different teas to see which ones have the best flavor. In this episode, we will be tasting 4 different Hojicha teas and seeing if any of them are good enough to become part of our collection, and join some of our fan favorites like the Noike Hojicha. We'll also be learning a little bit about what Hojicha tea is and how the flavor profile is developed during the unique production process. Let's get started. Okay, so what I have here are 4 different Hojicha teas. I was just meeting with the NeoTeas team recently and we did a tasting, so I wanted to recreate that for all of you here on YouTube. So basically, Hojicha is a very popular type of Japanese green tea. It's a roasted tea, so after the tea leaves are picked, steamed, and dried, they're turned in a hot pan or a roasting machine. And during that process, the leaves change from a vibrant green color to a kind of dark brown or a reddish brown. So the difference between a green tea and a black tea is that green teas are heated after the harvest, and this deactivates the enzymes that cause oxidation. And black teas are not heated immediately after harvest, so the enzymes like oxidase are able to kind of oxidize the tea leaf and change the flavor and the color and the final liqueur of the tea. And during this oxidation process, the tea converts its polyphenols into theaflavins and thearubicins. Polyphenols can give the tea kind of this fresh or grassy flavor, whereas the thearubicins and theaflavins kind of give it this more caramel, chocolatey, even slightly fruity flavor. So this is a quick refresher on the differences between green and black tea. And that being said, I would say that Hojicha actually starts to drift more into the direction of a black tea because of the roasting process. Even though it's not oxidized, it kind of shares a lot of characteristics with a black tea. Because it doesn't have that kind of vibrant grassy flavor that you would get from a sencha, for example. It tends more into the direction of caramel, chocolate, coffee, these types of things. I would say the difference between Hojicha and a black tea is that Hojicha does kind of have a little bit more of that roasted, not quite smoky flavor, but a little bit of that kind of black coffee kind of intensity to it. So what I did here is I measured out 4 different types of Hojicha teas. Just one thing to mention before we get to the tasting, I'm using tea strainers here. You may have recalled some videos of mine where I talk about why you shouldn't use the tea strainer. And I'm actually going to make an exception for this tasting just because there's so many different teas. I don't want to have 4 different teapots going here. It just makes things a little bit easier. And this is actually something you'll see professional tea tasters do. They'll use kind of a more simplified method so they can try many different teas back to back. So before we get started and brew the teas, let's take a quick look at the leaves. You'll notice there's different amounts here. It's the same weight, but because this one in particular is tightly rolled, it's made from probably slightly smaller pickings. The leaves are a little bit denser, so they don't occupy as much space, but they're more or less the same weight. I weighed these all out on a scale. And these leaves here, take a look at here. They're pretty light and flaky. There's a lot of stems here, and the stems are more or less hollow, so that's going to make them a little bit less dense as well. This one here is very unique. It's lighter roasted, as you can tell. So if we were to take this compared to one of the darker roasted ones, you see there's a very clear color difference between the two. This one is definitely roasted for either less time or a lower temperature or some combination of the two, and that's definitely going to transfer into the flavor of these teas. So another difference you might notice is the inclusion of the stems. Here it's easier to see because it's unroasted, so the stems are almost like a yellow color like they would be in a kukicha. Here it's a little bit harder to see, but there are some stems involved. And one of the things that makes Hojicha unique is the aroma coming off of the dry leaves is actually pretty powerful. So what you'll see in a lot of different teas is they kind of have their aromas locked into the leaf. That's one of the reasons why they're rolled, to kind of keep this flavor or aroma kind of locked in until it's infused into water, and then it releases it all at once. So I think Japanese sencha teas are an exception, but for the most part, teas will not produce a lot of aroma from the dried leaves. But Hojicha is a bit of an exception. This one I'm getting a pretty mellow roasted flavor from compared to this one. This one's a little bit woodier, a little bit darker. You can clearly tell it's darker roasted. This one Yeah, I notice a little bit more sweetness to this. So less woodiness, a little more sweetness. Probably has something to do with the fact that there's less stems and more leaves. And this one I would say is the strongest roast and probably the most of this kind of woody flavor. So let's go ahead and infuse these teas. We're going to be using 75 degrees Celsius water. You can use a little bit more of a higher temperature water for the brewing of Hojicha because you want to kind of pull out these kind of darker roasted tasting notes from the tea. And there's not as much of these catechins or polyphenols that would normally make your green tea bitter if you brewed it too high. So you can feel free to use a higher temperature water for Hojicha and even a longer brewing time if you want. So me, for example, I like Hojichas to be very strong. So I actually will let them brew a little bit longer to kind of extract more of this, this kind of strong roasted flavor. Okay, so let's put these to the side. Put these behind here. So the first thing you'll notice is the difference in color. These three seem more or less the same. They kind of have this reddish brown color, and this one you see is much lighter. So this is clearly because that this is a lightly roasted Hojicha. So it's still the same type of tea, but it's almost in a different category. So you kind of need to evaluate it under a different criteria, but we'll just go ahead and do the tasting and see which one that I like the most personally. And then another thing you'll notice is at the top of these, you have kind of this light layer of foam. So this is kind of like the essential oils of the tea kind of being released. Something you'll see in Sencha, Gyokuro, and also Hojicha. In terms of the darkest one, I would say maybe this one here. It's definitely got kind of the most of this reddish flavor. And this is more water than I would typically use. I would usually use like a more concentrated brewing for Hojicha, kind of maybe half the amount here. And this is one of the limitations you see with the strainers because of kind of how deep they go into the tea mug. You're not going to get a perfect infusion, but I want to continue using these for tastings because I want to kind of control all the variables, so I am comparing these teas on the same playing field. So let's go ahead and taste number one. And I actually have these numbered 1 through 4, so I can go back later. I don't know where each of these are from. I don't know the price. I'm just going to do kind of a blind tasting. So from this one, I would say I'm getting a very strong roasted flavor, more so than what I normally get from a Hojicha. So it's almost a little bit smoky, kind of like a note of like charcoal. So this right here, number 2. This one I really like. This is much more what I'm looking for in a Hojicha personally. What I find is that when there's too many stems, it kind of takes on, unless there's like a really dark roast to it, it tends to take on this almost woody flavor, which I don't like in Hojicha. It's a little bit too light for me. What I kind of like is those Hojichas made with more leaves that kind of have this really rich, sweet, kind of, not quite caramel, but give us another try. Yeah, this one's the most intense so far of the two of these, and it kind of has this in the finish. It's like got a little bit of this bitterness, almost like you would get from a coffee. It almost has like a little bit of a sourness in the finish, which I actually really like. Let's try that number 3. Okay, this one is not too special. I want to compare the two of these. Okay, so both of these, They're a little bit heavier roasted. They both have stems in them. They're very similar. I would say this one's probably a little bit darker. Let's try the two. I would say this one has a little bit more going on, but overall, both of them have a very diluted flavor compared to this one, which is mostly leaves, as we saw. Yeah, what I'm looking for in a Hojicha personally is I want this kind of a richness and this depth of flavor. And these ones are just a little bit lacking. They're just not quite as powerful. But let's try the light roast. I'm actually really impressed by this. You would think because it's lightly roasted, it wouldn't be as strong. But it for some reason has a very nice sweetness to it. I almost get a little bit of that popcorn flavor from it. Yeah, I would say tasting notes, a little bit of sweet popcorn, almost like kettle corn. Very nice. Obviously not quite as rich as this one, which is mostly leaves. But I would say these two are just a league above these two right here. These two are just a little bit watery. There's not quite enough going on. So for right now, I'm going to move these two to the back, and we're going to try to do a showdown between these two, the two favorites. So again, I mentioned these are kind of in a different category. One is a light roast, one is a dark roast. So the farmer that produced these is definitely going for a different type of tea, a different flavor profile. So just keep that in mind if you're evaluating Hojicha teas. Now that I taste them back to back, you can definitely, I get more of the char on this one. So it does have a tiny bit of that, like I mentioned before, kind of like that smoldering, kind of, I don't know how else to say it, but there's a particular smell when you pour water onto a fire. It's just kind of like this char, like this kind of mineral rich char. Yeah, very nice. This one's sweeter. It's kind of like almost like kettle corn, like it's popcorn, but with a tiny, tiny bit of caramelized sugar on top. Not quite caramel corn, but you know, kind of in between just a regular popcorn and caramel corn. And this one's got that char. It's got a little bit of that kind of sourness that you'd get from a coffee. It kind of has a little bit of a bitter finish, but in a good way. It kind of has like a nice kind of clean, crisp finish to it. I'm actually getting a little note of honey. I was trying to put my finger on it earlier. It's almost this kind of floral note. But not quite like you would get from an oolong, for example. It's just, it's almost like, I almost want to say like bitter honey. It has the flavor of honey, but not quite sweet yet. So it's that kind of floral note that you get from like a really high quality honey, but it's not super sweet. Like this one is a sweet Hojicha, for example. So yeah, personally, I like this one more because I'm a big fan of these really darker Hojicha teas, these more complex Hojicha teas. A lot of people are looking for a sweet Hojicha, and that's why the Know-About Hojicha is our most popular Hojicha, because that's a very sweet tea. It's produced outside of Kyoto in a pinewood forest, so it kind of has partial shading throughout the day, and it kind of builds a natural sweetness in the tea leaves. So if you're looking for a sweet Hojicha, I would recommend you go for the Know-About. That's not what this tea is. This is would be a new tea to us. And if you're looking for more of a rich, full-bodied Hojicha, I would go for the cookie Hojicha. So I know I said before that I don't like stem Hojichas, but this one is really darkly roasted, so it kind of compensates for that. So you don't get this wood flavor. You do kind of get that rich, complex, slightly bitter roasted flavor that personally I really like in a Hojicha. So thank you all so much for joining me on this tasting. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And if you want to try some of the Hojicha teas that we've selected after traveling around Japan and meeting with dozens of tea farmers, you can find them at neoteas.com. So if you could pick up a pack of that, it would really help to support this channel. And until then, we'll see you next time.